with Paula Zucker and Ana Sainz de la Peña. Welcome to Dual Language Learners and Early Literacy. Our focus today will be on family and community engagement in early childhood and programs for diverse learners. As a reminder, PATHN's mission is to support the efforts and initiatives of the Bureau of Special Education and to build the capacity of local educational agencies to serve students who receive special education services. PDE's commitment to the least restrictive environment is to ensure that for each child, the individualized education program IEP teams begin with the general education setting with the use of supplementary aids and services before considering a more restrictive environment. As we know, early childhood education and daycare programs across Pennsylvania are experiencing an increasing level of linguistic and cultural diversity among the children they serve. Dual language learners, young children who grow up speaking more than one language at home and in the classroom, bring to these classrooms unique learning strengths, experiences, and challenges. This three-part webinar addressed evidence-based teaching practices in language acquisition and literacy development for DLLs and Ls in pre-K to grade 2 settings. The three-part webinar focused in the first two parts on how does the emergent bilingual brain work and the examination of exemplary teaching practices in early childhood programs for DLLs and Ls. Today, in the third part of this webinar, we will examine family and community engagement in early childhood programs for diverse learners. In order to be awarded Act 48 credits, you must have attended all three webinars. If you are participating as a group, please contact Tina Reif at trife@pathn.net to let her know who is participating. You must also complete a Google survey at the end of each webinar. Directions to access the survey will be provided to you at the end of this presentation and must be completed prior to exiting the webinar. As a side note, the handouts will be shortly available on the website, and we will let you know when they are. Our participant outcomes for today are as follows. Identify culturally responsive practices in developing family and community engagement. Explore resources to enhance family and community engagement of the DLLs and Ls, and develop a plan to ensure that family and community stakeholders are included in academic program development. Before we jump in the crux of the matter on family and community engagement, we need to couch this knowledge within culturally responsive practices. In effect, what are culturally responsive educational systems? They are grounded in the belief that we need to build systems that are responsive to cultural difference and seek to include rather than exclude difference. Students who come from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds can excel in academic endeavors if their culture, language, heritage, and experiences are valued and used to facilitate their learning and development. Culturally responsive systems focus on enhancing, educational systems will be enhanced with additional cultural perspective or lenses within the people category when language minority students, families, and community agencies are included, within the practices category when cultural connections with each student in a class or school are included, or within the policies category when the need to reflect upon inclusive practices and searches to reduce barriers for students, families, and ethnic communities are also included. When we think of policies, we think of federal policies. Federal policies have been established to include rather than to exclude. The intent of ESSA is to raise achievement for low income and otherwise disadvantaged children. Under ESSA, the bar has been risen on family and community engagement requirements to ensure that gaps in educational opportunity and achievement are addressed within the school system, engaging parents, families, and communities as stakeholders in the school's decision-making. Title I has always emphasized parent outreach activities and set aside funding to do so. With ESSA, the emphasis is on targeting outreach activities for EL families. The intent of the Every Student Succeeds Act is to have parents and communities engage and help drive financial, programmatic, and policy decisions. For some of our immigrant families, this could be very challenging, given that they may not know the role parents in the US are asked to play in the education of their children. These families may have limited understanding of how the American school system functions and may also come from a culture where families are not as involved in the education of their children. Furthermore, a language barrier can impede immigrant families' engagement, more so if it entails being part of a decision-making stakeholder group. The process of engaging these families will require more scaffolds with multiple opportunities to be informed about their rights in the American educational system and supports regarding advocating for the education of their children, especially when these students are students with disabilities. I can give you a good example. I had a student in second grade that was learning English at a rapid rate. He was very balanced, bilingual, and was just learning the language at such a rapid rate compared to other peers, like peers. So I recommended the mother to write a letter to the school to have her child evaluated for possible gifted and talented services. She did not know that it had that gifted and talented referrals often came from the parents themselves. PDE is also anchoring its policies in a culture of equity. It has also developed specific policies in regards to English learners. State guidance can be found in the Basic Education Circular entitled Educating English Learners. Local educational agencies are required to provide all important information to families not proficient in English in their preferred language or mode of communication by employing interpreters and/or translators. The Basic Education Circular also provides a list of the documents that need to be made available to the families in that preferred language. Rather than give you an incomplete list, I would recommend that you refer to the Basic Education Circular for more details. But it includes, just to name a few, student discipline policies and procedures, report cards and progress reports, notices of parent-teacher conferences, information regarding gifted and talented programs, other information provided to native English-speaking parents, such as invitations to join school-related councils or groups or parent handbooks. As I said before, more on the language instruction educational program annual parent notification requirements can be found on the Basic Education Circular entitled Educating English Learners. Another piece that we need to address before we talk about specifically about family and community engagement is culture. Culture is like the air we breathe. It permeates all that we do. The hardest culture to examine is often our own. when we are surrounded by people that look like us from the same culture, because it shapes our actions in ways that seem second nature. You don't think about your culture when you're surrounded by people of the same culture. What feels normal, small reminds us, is molded by deeply ingrained social habits and ways of valuing. Learning about one's own culture, making the familiar strange, as anthropologist George Spindler has called it, is far more challenging than learning about the culture of others. Therefore, a critical step in making schools places where all children can learn is for educators to first see how their own cultural values operate in their classroom, from how they expect children to take part in discussions to whether they expect classroom materials to be shared or used individually. The iceberg concept of culture is a framework that helps us understand the concept of culture by dividing it in two parts, as in an iceberg. Surface culture, what is observable, and deep culture, what is hidden. Surface culture refers to the noticeable differences in groups, and they can be of three types. Demographic differences such as age, gender, race, physical abilities, and language. Material differences such as art, literature, architecture, crafts, music, dancing, clothing, food. Behavioral differences. These are the easily detected practices and norms of behavior in a group, such as body language, posture, gestures, facial expression, and eye movements. Forms of greetings. Conversation, does it include a handshake, or does it include a kiss on the cheek, or two in my case? Conversational patterns, rituals, festivals, and holidays. Like an iceberg, the majority of culture is below the surface. Deep differences are primarily out of conscious awareness, such as assumptions, expectations, attitudes, values, and beliefs that influence behaviors. They include different expectations about, for example, relationships, communication, time, power, problem solving. In the next slides, we're going to dig deeper into some of those concepts. When working across cultures, it is the deeper differences that tend to cause the most difficulty. Some aspects of deep culture that may impact education are listed here. Eye contact. Some children, especially from rural areas, and by the way, all of these are changing with globalization and urbanization. They are not stagnant in time. They evolve as the families acculturate to the US. They also depend on a whole lot of variables like education, experiences with authority, and so on and so forth. So these, please realize, are realizations. Some children may not give eye contact to adults as a form of respect, especially when they're scolded. Some cultures have smaller social distances that are typical in Pennsylvania society. Social distance as a norm is an arm length, while in some cultures it could be from the elbow to the hand as the norm for social distance between acquaintances. Roles of males and females in education, roles of males and females as students, as parents. Those are things that educators need to find out from the families that they teach. It's very easy to find resources online on culture. Nowadays, all you need to do is type the people group and cultural differences, and usually it will bring you a whole bunch of aspects of deep culture that might influence learning. The other piece is the University of Michigan has two books on that are specific about education. One is entitled Understanding International Students, and the other one is Understanding Refugee Students. If you Google University of Michigan and those two titles, you will be able to easily find it. And when I'm no longer the one presenting, I will place them in the chat for some that might be interested in knowing that. We're going to talk about expectations of school roles in a little bit, but I did want to alert you to the fact that in many places in the world, teachers, principals play a very formal role in the education of students. And some of the families, immigrant families, struggle with teachers and principals that are dressed down, for example, on a Friday with jeans, maybe business casual, where in their culture, the teachers and principal are wearing suits and skirts. The relationship between teacher and student is a much more formal role in many places in the world. The other piece is time orientation. You may or may not have noticed that some of our families, for them, time is not as specific as American time. I had the opportunity to live in Haiti for 3 years, and when there were events, we would say, is it American time or is it Haitian time? If it is American time, we were expected to be there 5 minutes prior to the event or right on time. If it was a Haitian event, you were not to be showing your face earlier than 15 minutes late. So if the event was at 2 o'clock, you would not show up at prior to 2:15 or even 2:30. And it was quite appropriate to be an hour late for a dinner, for example. And discipline in many countries is much more strict and much more physical than it is in US schools. So those are things to consider as we see our immigrant children acculturating to society here. As I mentioned earlier, in many cultures, the education of children is not a partnership between educators and families. With new immigrants, we need to be aware that the role of being the first and best teacher of their child may be a new concept for them. Families in many parts of the world are not all required to be involved in schools. Expectations for family engagement will vary across cultures. The importance of explicitly stating the role families are expected to play in the US schools, it cannot be underscored. Another way to look at cultures is to look at it from the continuum of individualistic and collectivist societies. It is a framework that describes two contrasting value systems, individualism and collectivism, which differ in their relative emphasis on fostering independence and success of the individual versus interdependence and success of the group. While individualistic cultures stress self-reliance and personal achievement, collectivistic societies focus more on developing and sustaining a stable, mutually dependent group. These fundamental values help form notions of people's rights and responsibilities, what roles they may take within societies, norms of communication, and ideas of how to rear and educate children. Before looking at how these differing orientation can play out in the home and classroom, it's important to reiterate an obvious caution that I've already shared. To generalize is always to simplify, but this dualistic framework is not intended to stereotype cultural behavior. Human experience is far too complex to fit neatly into any conceptual scheme. Individual differences will always trump cultural differences. The framework's power lies in the way it generates insights and understandings that enable teachers to bridge cultural differences, the way it gets us questioning, trying to identify for ourselves what social expectations and ethical values are at work in a frustrating classroom situation or a parent-teacher conference. The Wested Bridging Culture in Early Care and Education has identified 7 sources of homeschool conflict. The individualistic perception is that the parent's role includes active engagement in a child's academic growth at home, while the collectivist society is that the teacher is the one, and that the parent's role is to rear up considerate, cooperative children, the social skills. So to say it again, is that in the individualistic society, it's the parent's role to include, to be actively engaged in a child's academic growth at home, while the collectivistic view is that the teacher is the one responsible for teaching the child, and the parent's role is to rear up considerate, cooperative children, the social skills. Personal property and respecting boundaries are both highly valued in an individualistic culture. The words of a 2-year-old are usually the first few words they say is mine. But sharing and group ownership is characteristic of collectivistic society. Recently, a kindergarten in Western Colorado became the hot topic of the day on national talk radio because a teacher took school supplies from one student and added them to a collective pot that all the students would then use. The teacher simply saw the sharing of supplies in a classroom that included many children from migrant homes as a normal way to ensure that all students had everything needed for the year, at least from a collectivistic point of view. Parent-teacher conferences may become uncomfortable when a teacher praises a student to her parents, since criticism is more commonly used to conform a child's behavior to an established norm in collectivistic societies. One way that culturally sensitive teachers have balanced their communication with parents is to make sure that when a teacher offers compliments on a child's performance, it is directly related to how the child's strengths and achievement have contributed to the group. Finally, critical thinking and the ability to engage in discussion and argument are all valued attributes of the ideal student, according to current educational theory. Individualistic parents tend to socialize their children to ask questions, speak up, and tell the teacher what you need. However, parents from collectivistic backgrounds may be confused by teachers' emphasis on oral self-expression. In their view, a quiet student learns more and is more respectful than one who speaks up, singling herself out from the group and taking time away from the teacher's lesson. It's important to note that across cultures, the amount of nurturing provided to children vary greatly. Some cultures do not expect children to feed themselves on their own until they're well into elementary school. Adults from individualistic societies encourage children to feed themselves from infancy on and give them a certain amount of choice about what to eat and how much. Independence is the goal, which is the reason adults teach self-help skills and allow personal choices. In collectivistic tendencies, adults feed babies and don't push them to feed themselves, encouraging children to accept help. Obedience is emphasized over individual choice. The goal is interdependence. Helping others is modeled. When self-help skills are encouraged, they derive from the desire to make the feeding process or the dressing process smoother for everybody involved, thereby promoting group harmony. I could go on and on about the other pieces, but if you want more information on this topic, you will find it in Bridging Cultures in Early Care and Education, a training module by Gonzalez, Zepeda, Roasting-Fish, and Trumbull. One thing we need to consider in the in our family and community engagement is the acculturation process. Where are our families in the acculturation process? Acculturation is the process of adopting cultural traits and social patterns of another group. This process is most commonly discussed regarding a minority culture adopting elements of the majority culture, as is typically the case with immigrant groups that are culturally or ethnically distinct from the majority in the place to which they have immigrated. Acculturation can take different forms and have different outcomes, depending on the strategy adopted by the individuals or groups involved in the exchange of culture. The strategy used will be determined by whether the individual or group believes it is important to maintain his or her original culture and how important it is to them to establish and maintain relationships with the greater community and society whose culture differs from their own. The 4 different combinations of answers to these questions lead to 5 different strategies and outcomes of acculturation. Some of these outcomes are considered additive, while others are considered subtractive acculturation processes. Elena Makarova, a scholar who studies cultural identity development, recommends that educators support what some experts call additive or bicultural acculturation, a process that allows new immigrants to adjust to their new culture while still maintaining pride in and substantive connections to their heritage and their country of origin. Makarova notes that this approach helps immigrant students lead healthier and more successful lives at school. So, to summarize, additive acculturation will lead to better outcomes for children who are new or in the process of acculturating to American schools. Paula, in the next section, will start talking about the topic of this webinar, culturally responsive family, school, and community engagement. Paula?
Thank you, Francine. When we think about it, a family is a child's first teacher. When families partner with schools and community organizations, children thrive. And to produce the best results for students, we have to build the capacity of families, educators, schools, and community organizations in an effort to collaborate, exchange ideas, and develop and implement policies and action plans. Culturally responsive family, school, and community engagement is a process that develops over time. Consider that a family is the child's first teacher, and how important it is to include that first teacher in the collaborative mix in an effort to exchange ideas and develop and implement policies and those action plans. The inclusion of the inherent strengths that the family brings in collaboration with the strengths of the educators and community members will serve to strengthen the success of their children. There are 8 competencies for culturally responsive teaching, as compiled in the March 2019 Culturally Responsive Teaching, a 50-state survey of teaching standards. In that survey, it is recommended that these competencies should be included in all teaching standards. Competency 1 reflect on one's cultural lens. Culturally responsive educators routinely reflect on their own life experiences and membership in various social groups, such as by race, ethnicity, social class, and gender. And they ask themselves how these factors influence their own beliefs about cultural diversity. They actively work to develop cultural competency that includes understanding, sensitivity, and appreciation for the history, values, experiences, and lifestyles of other cultures. They also gain comfort having critical conversations and challenging stereotypes and prejudices when they meet up with them. Competency, too, recognize and redress bias in the system. Culturally responsive educators seek to deepen their understanding of how social markers such as race, ethnicity, social class, and language influence the educational opportunities that learners receive. Competency 3, communicate in linguistically and culturally responsive ways. When educators communicate in culturally sensitive ways, students and families feel more welcome and are inclined to participate in the schools. Culturally responsive teachers seek to understand how culture influences communication, both in verbal ways, through the tone of voice, rhythm, and vocabulary usage, and nonverbal ways, such as the amount of space between speaker and listener, eye contact, body movements, and gestures. Culturally responsive teachers also work to honor and accommodate home languages, including by advocating for translation services and resources in various languages. Competency 4, draw on students' culture to shape curriculum and instruction, is the belief that students' cultural background is a resource to learning, a resource. Culturally responsive teachers plan learning encounters that validates students' lived realities, cultural identities, and their heritage. Competency 6, collaborate with families and the local community. A strong homeschool partnership is critical to supporting academic success. That will be repeated and repeated today, and it's also been mentioned in the past webinar. Culturally responsive educators assume that parents are interested in becoming involved in their children's education. They aim to develop the trust of diverse families to ensure they are involved at all levels of their child's education throughout the year. They continually seek to learn more about the local community as well as families and their cultures and values. Competency 6, bring real-world issues into the classroom.
See how exciting
Culturally responsive teachers address the so what factor of instruction by helping students see how the knowledge and skills they learn in school are valuable for their lives, families, and communities. They ask, what does this material have to do with your lives? Competency 7, promote respect for students' differences. Culturally responsive teaching practices are best implemented in environments that are respectful, inclusive, and help learners value the cultures of their peers. And competency 8, model high expectations for all students. Culturally
Do me a
responsive
favor.
educators
I need the
adopt the
charger so
view
my phone
that
doesn't.
all students are capable of academic success. That is a belief that research shows is critical to supporting student growth. At enrollment is the best time to gather data on student sociocultural context. In early childhood settings, you may administer a family languages and interests interview, or in K-12 settings, the PDE family interview as part of the state-mandated screening, identification, and placement criteria. Finding out about the family's sociocultural context is key to building our background knowledge regarding who our students are. Are they refugees? Are they new arrivals? Have they faced trauma? Are they second-generation immigrants? Are they living with relatives? Are they homeless, migrant, in foster care? What is the preferred language of the family? What are literacy practices of the family? The family's educational background, child's developmental milestones, and so on. What are the family's educational goals and expectations? Learn about the family's socialization and acculturation patterns. Has the child been staying at home, or has the child had preschool experience? Attending church activities. How integrated is the family in the community? Is the family the only models of the home language? Gathering that data will provide you with valuable information on how best to meet the needs of dual language learners, English learners, and their families. Immigrant families are not all the same. Some arrive here with limited education and limited resources. Others come with enough education and resources to help them more readily understand and navigate the American school system. We as educators need to know their backgrounds: linguistic, social, cultural, education, what their level of acculturation is, etc. Dual language learners are a highly diverse group with a wide variety of experiences in English. Some children have well-developed skills in English. Others have English as their first language and are learning a second language. They have a broad range of experiences in their home language or languages. Some children spend most or all of their time listening to and speaking in their home language. Others have brothers and sisters, parents, grandparents, and friends who switch back and forth between their home language and English. They have many different learning experiences, interactions with books, exposure to written language. Some families talk to and read with their children often. Others are more focused on children learning how to play and interact with others. They have their own individual characteristics, preferences, temperament, skills, and abilities. This requires early childhood practitioners to individualize and specifically address those diverse strengths and needs of every dual language learner in order to ensure that everyone is ready for school success. The diversity among dual language learners is a source of rich experiences and possibilities. Dual language learners and ELs with disabilities must be given the disability-related services to which they are entitled. It is imperative to note that school districts must ensure that all children, regardless of their parents' or guardians' immigration status, who may have a disability and may require services under the IDEA or Section 504, are located and evaluated for special education and disability-related services in a timely manner. Remember also that these children may also receive ESL instruction if required. Infants and toddlers who are eligible as a child with a disability, birth through age 2, under the IDEA and their families receive early intervention services under IDEA Part C. Children and youth with disabilities ages 3 to 21 who are eligible receive special education and related services under IDEA Part B. These services must be made available to otherwise eligible children and, where applicable, their families without regard to the child's immigration status or that of his or her parents or guardians. So please remember that it is irregardless of the parents' or child's or family's immigration status. All students with disabilities are protected from discrimination and, if eligible, are entitled to receive free, appropriate public education under Section 504. When teachers and families share information about children, the results are better teaching in the classroom. Information from families provides teachers with a comprehensive picture of the child. This enables teachers to better adjust their teaching to the individual child. Better support for learning beyond the classroom, involving families in developing children's learning goals, increases opportunities for families to support those goals at home as well as in the community. Effective family engagement is linked to improved child outcomes. These positive outcomes include, as you can see here, biliteracy, cognitive, math, social, emotional skills, long-term academic achievement, increased parent and family involvement, family culture and language preservation, which is so absolutely important. Families strengthen their children's learning by providing support that continues outside the classroom. The primary purpose of partnering with families is to support children's development and learning. Review information from families about children's backgrounds and observations of children's behaviors at home. Provide providing staff with a more comprehensive picture of children's learning. The teaching team comes to understand each family's values, parenting practices, and children's interests so that they may better individualize their teaching. By working in collaboration with the teaching team on assessment, families improve their ability to observe and promote children's development and learning. Staff and families engage in, as you've heard before, two-way communication and participate in decision-making as equal partners. In order to support learning and development for children who are dual language learners, early childhood staff need to understand children's backgrounds and experiences with more than one language. Staff should gather information from each child's parents and family. By gathering this information to get the full picture of a child's overall language background, the educators can put together the puzzle of his or her languages and use this information for curriculum planning, individualizing, and supporting continued progress. So these are considerations for each child. To look at each of these puzzle pieces, we can see, first of all, what languages does your family speak? The language background of 1, 2, or more languages. The second piece of the puzzle is dual language development. Is it simultaneous or sequential? Did your child grow up with 2 languages from birth, which would be simultaneous? Or did your child grow up with 1 language from birth and then learn a second language after age 2, which would be sequential? Another part of the puzzle is looking at language dominance. The next would be the home language experiences, and then English language experiences, and finally, individual characteristics of the child. Additional examples of types of information that family members might contribute about their child may be samples of children's work, photos or video clips from home, a checklist completed by families or completed with staff, family-friendly journals sent back and forth between home and school. These are some misconceptions that families may feel, but when programs and families partner, these misconceptions can be dispelled. When programs and families partner, young dual language learners are more likely to learn both languages and thrive academically. So family engagement and dual language learners ensure that families feel respected and supported, take time to learn about them, and build on their funds of knowledge. What do we mean by funds of knowledge? Families come with the best information about themselves and their child. So we need to find how we can honor that. We must develop an attitude of openness and willingness to learn from parents and families. Begin by asking the family about what's important to them. Employ staff who speak their language. That's the language that's common to the families and in their communities. With the family help, use the child's home language in the classroom. Ask family and community members to volunteer. As mentioned in webinar 2, the family interview serves 2 purposes. It informs the early childhood provider and connects with the family in culturally responsive ways. Dual language learners' families are often underrepresented in home visiting programs. There are greater challenges when home visitor and families do not speak the same language. Some families are living in fear of deportation, and early childhood providers may not be welcomed because of this fear. Possible strategies for bringing them to us and us to them, and establishing that relationship may be to invite them to come in when they're dropping off their children, maybe coming to breakfast with their child, coming in for coffee, inviting them to a school activity in the community. Providing welcoming environments which incorporate their languages and cultures within the early childhood education program can only build trust and respect. There are some bright spots in Pennsylvania where more bilingual and bicultural staff are hired to provide the supports that are needed. The best approach is to find out about the communities and hire bilingual individuals who live in those communities. Again, this is one way of building trust. A cultural broker can help you learn about the culture of the children in your class. A home language model can interact directly with children and use their home language to help them feel more comfortable and to support their home language development. Individuals related to the early childhood program or within this local community may serve as cultural brokers for home language models. Screening, in addition to the regular background checks and screening procedures used by your program, you will want to ask other questions before engaging a potential cultural broker or home language model, such as, does the person's knowledge and skills closely match your needs? Are cultural brokers knowledgeable about the culture of one or more children in the class? And do home language models speak the same language as one or more of the children in your class? Cultural brokers and home language models are individuals who can help to make children and their families feel accepted and welcome as they adjust to new environments. The home language models speak the same home language and regional dialect as one or more children. They're usually native speakers of the language and have training in how to model their home language for children. A cultural broker can help you learn about the culture of the children in your class and can model and can interact directly with the children and use their home language to help them feel more comfortable and to support their home language development as well. Consider these, the following in assisting your process for establishing a welcoming environment and welcoming interactions with culturally and linguistically diverse families. Additionally to what you see here, you can pair families with the same language and cultural backgrounds. You can provide on-site interpreters and translators, and those would be qualified interpreters and translators. Minimize language load by providing lots of visual representations. And remember that dismissal time is a great time for you to have a captive audience with parents who are picking up their children from school. Encourage families to use their language with children from birth. Help parents understand that children can learn more than one language at the same time. In fact, children will have an easier time learning English if they have a strong foundation in their first language. All families have a rich heritage to pass on to their children. Encourage that through stories, chants, rhymes, poems, sayings, and songs. Share books and stories. Many families worry that reading and telling their stories in their home language will make it harder for their children to read in English. But ensure them that the opposite is actually true, and encourage them to read and tell stories in their home language. Encourage them to talk about their traditions and culture, and show that you value home languages in your classroom. Look for community events in which families' languages are spoken. Look at libraries, programs, cultural festivals, speakers, and concerts, which are great places for families to meet others who speak their home language. And finally, encourage families to continue using their home language as their children grow older. Thank you very much. And Anna will talk to you about many ways to communicate.
Thank you, Paula. Well, Paula and Francine have really given you a very strong background information regarding the importance of developing effective strategies to engage families and communities so children can learn better, and actually all of the family can start communicating better and acculturating better. I am going to emphasize the importance of looking at many ways to communicate. So in this section, what we're going to do is almost like connecting the dots, so you can create a plan that will be very effective to have your families really not only acculturating to their new environments, but also supporting their children in the process of acquiring the wonderful standards that we have in our state, as well as to be happy in school and graduating and becoming active and productive members of our community. We have talked a lot about how can we communicate with parents in a way that is going to be meaningful to them. As you know, parents who come from other countries may or may not have a lot of knowledge in the use of different technologies that we have for communication. But you might be surprised because cell phones and the use of email and the use of computers have been really, a global activity now. So sometimes we really need to have conversations with these parents and not just assume certain ways that they will actually prefer their communication to happen between the school community and their own families. So conversation is the very first step that you should have with your families. Talk to them about the different ways that you would like to communicate or that your school offers to communicate with families. Here we have on the screen a list of the different ways that you may have as a list, for parents to know that you offer all of these ways for communicate with parents. So talk to them, ask them questions. What would be their best way? Don't just assume. So definitely, we need to start using the number one way to communicate, which is face-to-face. Here we have a checklist for planning effective family engagement programs. As we were saying at the beginning of our webinars, we always go back to policy, right? So we said that in ESSA, which is our federal law regarding the education of all children, we said that in that section of ESSA, there's a targeted emphasis, I would say, into family engagement. So we, as institutions of education, need to start creating those plans that ESSA requires for us to have, either for Title I or Title III, or for both, I should say. So here we have 3 areas that you should be looking into in order to develop your plan. The first area is to strengthen outreach efforts. When we say strengthen outreach efforts, what we're talking about is how do you communicate in your community that you are offering early childhood programs? How do you advertise so parents will come and register their children in your programs? It is very important that you know where to go in order to get the best way to outreach these families. So what strategies are you using will be, what strategies do you use to outreach and advertise your programs to bring families into your buildings? Those efforts need to be, revisit in order to see how effective they are. So we will be talking more about what strategies are really good for or good to strengthen outreach efforts. So number 1, outreach efforts. Number 2 is to improve the enrollment process. And that is so important because sometimes we don't make things very easy for parents. I mean, in general, for all parents, there's a whole bunch of forms, information that is repetitive. Sometimes, we ask them to fill out one form and then the same information goes in a different form. So look at the documentation that you have in order to enroll children in your programs, in your facilities, and try to reduce those barriers of access. Remember, your parents are also English learners. They are in the process of acculturating to a new home. Therefore, these kinds of enrollment processes that entitle a lot of different information that they might not bring when they are registering students need to change. So review your enrollment process and take a look and see where are you asking for the same information more than once, and try to streamline it in a way that is efficient and effective. So number 1, outreach efforts. Number 2, enrollment process. How is your enrollment process? 3, create immigrant-friendly programs. When we say immigrant-friendly programs, it's actually, are we really addressing the needs of immigrant families? This is very important because if our centers, if our schools are not really considering the fact that these children come from immigrant families, you have to actually start looking at what does that mean? How am I going to actually implement more ways to make these families feel welcome, to make these families feel as, you know, that they're going through this process with the right supports that they need? Am I going to use my schools to be almost like you know, a brokerage place where they can also find information about health programs that are offered in the community, maybe about health centers, or maybe about job you know, training programs or ESL classes? Am I providing that information? Because if families are coming into my building, and I am, you know, I have a captive audience, maybe they should be reading or looking into connecting with other issues that pertain to immigrant families. So that is important, that we start looking at our programs and say, how can I improve my programs in relation to the populations that I have now? Create welcoming environments. That's number 4. So how do I create a welcoming environment in my building? Well, the number one thing is that you need to have, as the very first group of people that welcomes these families, staff that smile. Okay, so that's the number one thing. How am I training the staff, the support staff, secretaries, office staff, to actually be welcoming, to understand that these families have a hard time to communicate in English, for example, that they know who to call in order to come and help with the translation services, that they know that if there's a family that speaks Arabic and there are forms that are translated to Arabic, they can actually hand them that form and help them navigate that process. Welcoming environments also deal with having a plan to train your faculty, your teachers, having a plan to connect with translation services, having a plan to connect with community-based organizations, and so forth. So in your plan, number 1, you have to go to the root cause and look at some of your outreach efforts. The second part is, how is your enrollment process? The third part, you need to be looking at how are you offering specific programs or specific strategies to make your school immigrant friendly. And then the last piece, which is very important, is how are you making your environment welcoming? If I am going to plan for this effective way to engage families, one of the things that I need to talk about, as I said before, is that outreach plan. So how am I really looking at the way that I support that area of outreach, as well as the area of already registering children? When I look at that, you need to be looking at the screening process, because part of making this more streamlined is who will be doing what. So you have to look at the kinds of assessments you will be implementing with the children. So parents know ahead of time that they will have to, you know, have some time to be in your building so they can support the screening process. Maybe recognize also that there could be some delays in some groups of children, but be aware that those delays and concerns regarding child development need to be framed within the parameters of second language acquisition, and also within the parameters that these children have other cultural traits that might be very different from the expectations that we have for all families. The other part is that how am I really going to have a way to provide families with some training, with some advice? Like I said before, look at your community-based organization so you can hook up these families with services that are going to help them to actually develop themselves in a healthy manner within those communities. And the last part, as I said before, training, build capacity among your staff and among your faculty. As I said before, how can you simplify? How can you streamline that process that most of the time really become barriers for these families every time they have to go into your buildings or into your centers to enroll their children? The number one thing is that you have to keep communication open with these families. And the eligibility requirements, you have to ensure that there has been some prior communication so they will come prepared to offer you maybe some of the documentation that you require. Now, a word of caution, in many instances, your immigrant families might come from, the perspective of not having the right documentation due to refugees do not leave their countries with a whole bunch of information like, birth certificates and all of that. So any other way that they can prove the age of the child will be, something that you have to discuss with your staff. The other part is that if they are undocumented immigrants, there has to be that area, that gray area in which you have to accept some of, the documentation that they may have in order to prove, some of the records of those children. If, you need, again, to communicate that eligibility clearly ahead of time. And remember, it doesn't matter the status of the child or the parents, they have the right to have a public education, okay? So that is one of the most important things about your enrollment. Translate documents ahead of time. Be ready with some interpreters, qualified interpreters that will be around to support these families. Enrollment is for many of these families, it's a new process. They don't know what to do. They don't know what to expect. So have a lot of your staff available to support these families. Provide flexible options. Families can actually show their place of residence using different kinds of documents. Sometimes they do not have a lease, where they rent an apartment. Sometimes one or two families live together. So you have to actually be flexible in regards to how do you require this to demonstrate their place of residence. Provide transportation to support your young children from early learning programs. This is important because in many instances, many immigrant families use public transportation, and sometimes, the bringing children to your centers needs to be discussed. So maybe transportation can be offered, and during enrollment, that is a very important topic to talk about. Okay, so as we said, hold on a minute, what did I do here? We have to actually consider the fact that many of these immigrant families do not have a lot of trust in government. So you have to build that trust. You have to go from those channels to create a welcoming environment where they feel safe and they also know that their children will be safe. How do you demonstrate that respect for diversity? Is by incorporating, these cultural brokers, by incorporating environments in your school that actually say, we know you are here and we like you to be here, through books, through ways to make them welcome for events, integrate some of their cultural traditions, religions, discuss some of that in your school. It's important to have parents maybe reading stories to the children, bringing artifacts so they can show how their culture really values education, because all the cultures in the world value education. And in some places, it's even, considered at a very high level, even higher than what we have here. We can create welcoming environments by intentionally using the child's first language for instruction. It is important that maybe parents are invited to, again, tell stories in their first language, and have teachers actually learn maybe a few words in those languages, so children feel that their language is part of the school day, is part of what they see in posters, in bulletin boards. It's also part in the way that you incorporate and respect some of their traditions. It is also very important that parents have a chance to express their concerns, give some ideas, talk about, the hardship that they have. So being good listeners in schools also create welcoming environments. When there are some delays or students are struggling with some specific behavior, issues, we need to actually talk to these parents and be more open-minded in regards to ways that sometimes children behave, because it might be just a reflection of certain rules that are okay at home, but they are not okay in school. So opening up to a conversation of why things are happening actually will bring light into behaviors that for us could be strange or out of the ordinary, but for some children at home will be just the way things are at home. So cultures really have a lot of different ways of expressing discipline. So please talk about it with families. As Francine already talked about with the iceberg, there are many behaviors that are considered very appropriate in one culture, but they are not appropriate in this culture. So information is important. Families are in that process. Please talk. Please discuss. Don't jump into conclusions. Don't just, label the child as having a disability or being, go and get some evaluations because they cannot feed themselves and they are 5 years old. Well, maybe they are not expected to do that at home. So how do you bridge that? How do you work that with families? And again, there's the delays and concerns need to be talked about. And if there's going to be screening about the language ability of the child, please, or even following directions or 3-part directions, all of that needs to be really talked about with parents. There are on the screen that you have many ways to look also at language. We are very worried about language delays and language barriers, because that we're talking about two different issues here. In many instances, when you don't have ESL teachers or professionals who can actually assess whether the delay is a language barrier or is it, a cognitive delay, people are jumping into conclusions and without really considering the fact that the child might be, acquiring both languages at the same time, or might be actually acquiring a second language, which can be translated into some ways of delay. But that is not a disability. It's a language acquisition process barrier. So please monitor your students, collect evidence before you jump into conclusions, look for experts to actually make those decisions, and use people who are experts in the area of second language acquisition, ESL teachers. How can I strengthen family and caregivers' engagement efforts? As I said before, it is important that you open up and try to really include more and more information about how to bridge the ability of these families to interrelate to their new environment, and also to do things in a way that you are inviting also parents to learn about how is expected or what is expected in school. Things as simple as having, get-togethers after school, where parent-teacher conferences become really, welcoming environments and not just, ways to complain about the child. So this is important, and we need to consider these ways to relate to families. The best thing that you can do here is definitely to build staff capacity and knowledge. Please include in your family outreach, family engagement program, how are you going to actually build capacity with your staff? You have to train your teachers in culturally responsive practices across the board. Everybody in your building, if you have diverse families there, needs to know that there are ways to address the needs of all students. And if you have your administrators, as well as considering the policies that you have in your school that might be affecting some of these immigrant families because they might be undocumented, you need to look at those issues ahead of time and see how you can bridge and change some of your policies, because you have to actually, look at who are these children, who are the families that you have there, so you can actually be providing for all of them a safe environment. You have to look for opportunities to support all families. And supporting families has to do with knowing what they need. Actually, in our webinar here, we have many of these slides offer you with ways that you can support all families through community-based organization, through churches, through newspapers that are written in multiple languages. It's important that you know where these families go, so you can actually provide information in those places, flyers about what you're going to be doing, in regards to registration and other events that you will have in your schools. We need to strengthen those outreach efforts because we are not getting to them. And it's important that we know what to do in order to support all families. If we invest in dedicated community and family outreach personnel, it's very important. Please hire more bilingual, bicultural staff and start looking at how you can actually strengthen those outreach efforts, as well as creating a safe community in school for your families. This is just, what we consider a good way to start with a plan. You have to write down the strategy or the statement to see what is in place, and then you look at next steps. When I talk about that, we already said that the number one step is the outreach efforts. The number two is your screening process or your registration process. Then how do you make your school welcome? Those are the kinds of elements that you need to be looking in a plan. What is the statement? What is in place? And what I need to do to get there? This is a good way to look at a plan. And please remember that young dual language learners are not here only to learn a new language, but they are also in the process of acculturation, and they also need to grow academically. And we need to look at what they bring to the table so we can partner with the families to continue growing what they bring to the table. But at the same time, we value bilingualism, biculturalism, and biliteracy. Why? Because it benefits not only the child, but our society. It benefits our economic growth as a state. By building school climates with parents and families that are very much important part of our community, we are actually strengthening our own communities. Communities that are welcoming, educational communities that look at parents from the perspective of partners are really the ones that have children, real success stars in their schools. If you want your children to graduate in your programs, in your educational programs, start building up that real partnership with parents. Not the one that we have been talking about this for the past, I think, 20 years through Title I. Parents are important. Parents are important. Yes, we know they are important, but we say it, but we don't see them as stakeholders. So this is, a way to tell you that now you have to demonstrate with evidence that you are doing something to actually make these parents stakeholders in the education of their children. So I hope that what we have presented, which we brought from different resources that we always offer at the end of our webinars, we hope that you can look at these resources and you can start really developing effective plans to bring these families into the scenario of educational success for their children. So we have resources here galore. And we also touch with Pennsylvania Oakdale Dual Language Learners Resources. Very nice to go to Oakdale. They also have a lot of resources that have been developed bilingually, and they have good things for parents that speak Spanish. So far, we only have the Spanish language. Hopefully, we will have more. And you have been great audience, and we also want you to get credit for being great audience, right? So this is the link that you have to Google to answer, the Google survey, and I will leave it there so you can do it right now, so you can answer the questions and actually consider and follow the directions there. So. And don't forget the code is 1112EL, all together, 1112EL. And the tiny URL, okay. Sounds like a little different. But anyway, you have it there, and please go there so you can actually answer the survey, and you will be, fine with this last webinar. Actually, all 3 webinars will be archived as early as next week. So if you would like to review or you would like to share some of this information with others, all of the 3 webinars will be archived on our patent website. As early as next week, you can start checking on that. Thank you very much for being again a good audience, and we wish you good luck at developing your plans. I think we have given you the first step, so you can continue building up on the next steps. Thank you.